Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Last Monday, we started discussing the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran. We stated that this agreement was formulated now because Iran saw the opportunity to turn its perceived strategic gains into a formal reality. I still believe this is the case, despite the fact that during this last week we've seen strikes restart. Iran hit two vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, stating that they were following unauthorized transit routes. This is the route that travels close to the coast of Oman. Iran's chief negotiator also told Iranian state media that the Strait of Hormuz will never go back to the way it was before the war. Iran will attempt to formalise its strategic gains, while also standing firm against any major concessions that would restrict them too strongly. The United States responded with a series of strikes against radar systems, missile facilities, and drone storage facilities in Iran. The United States and Trump personally are also incentivised to pursue a deal for many reasons, as we discussed last week. If the war was to restart, the scenario that I see as most likely is the United States escalating dramatically in an attempt to end the war quickly. However, as of today, both sides remain incentivised for a deal, as shown in the last day, with both sides agreeing to stop these escalatory strikes. But the recent events do highlight how fragile this Memorandum of Understanding truly is, and there is still a long way to go before an agreement is reached. Such a deal has to be tolerable for both sides, which, with some issues more than others, this could be a struggle. Now, if we look to history, the fact that we find ourselves in this tense environment was started by Trump during his first term, when he left the JCPOA in pursuit of a different nuclear deal with Iran. No such deal arose, and today we find the United States attempting to return to some form of deal. And so today we're going to compare the JCPOA to this potential deal of today. Where are both deals similar, and where do they differ? It's this question that we'll explore today. So, what was the JCPOA? The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or it was also called the Iran Nuclear Deal, was created in July of 2015. It included China, France, Germany, Iran, Russia, the UK, the United States, and the European Union as signatories. More important than the nations involved, however, were the conditions of the deal. Firstly, as a part of the deal, Iran could only enrich uranium up to 3.67% enrichment for the next 15 years. Iran also had to cut its stockpile of enriched uranium from close to 10,000 kilograms to 300 kilograms. Iran also reduced its centrifuge numbers and the number of facilities through which it could enrich. As a part of the JCPOA, Fordow was the nuclear facility that could no longer enrich uranium, and it was instead converted into a research facility. Natanz became the only site where enrichment could occur. Also, as a part of the deal, Iran agreed to monitoring from the International Atomic Energy Agency. In return for this deal, Iran received sanctions relief and access to international financial systems. The Iranians also saw restrictions on crude exports, banking, shipping, and trade eased. Now, at the time, critics argued that this deal didn't target Iran's ballistic missile program, and it also didn't address Iran's regional proxies in the Middle East. The deal also included many temporary clauses that one day would need renegotiating. However, with the power of hindsight, how does this deal, the JCPOA, compare to the Memorandum of Understanding of today? And how has the geopolitical environment changed since 2015? Now, the following are the characteristics that are important to the current Memorandum of Understanding that we can also compare to the JCPOA. The first is enriched uranium. Currently, there is no permanent cap on enrichment percentage as a part of this Memorandum of Understanding of today. Future negotiations for the United States will likely seek to dilute Iran's highly enriched uranium. One rumour is that dilution will occur inside Iran, likely monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency, if inspections do return. Some officials within Iran have stated that inspections won't return, despite the International Atomic Energy Agency stating that they will. Because the current Memorandum of Understanding doesn't have a cap on enrichment, this is currently weaker than the JCPOA. Next, we have the stockpile of enriched uranium that Iran possesses. The existing stockpile within Iran is around 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. As of the current Memorandum of Understanding, this enriched uranium won't be removed from Iran, and its status is currently unknown. This gives Iran a huge information advantage in this conflict. Trump has sought to downplay the role of Iran's highly enriched uranium in the last few weeks, stating that it is, quote, nuclear dust, after June 2025's attacks on Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The Israelis are important here because they see Iran's potential possession of a nuclear weapon as existential. If no agreement is reached to remove or reduce the size of Iran's stockpile, the Israelis could once again seek to restart the conflict with Iran. Iran has stated in the past that it will not give up its highly enriched uranium, which could be one of the biggest points of negotiation that leads to a disagreement that can't be solved. Because there is no such part of the current Memorandum of Understanding to address the stockpile, this is also weaker than the JCPOA. Now, when it comes to Iran's centrifuges, as a part of the JCPOA, they were reduced in number and they were all located at Natanz. There is no equivalent aspect in the current Memorandum of Understanding to restrict the number of centrifuges or to restrict the number of locations in which they can house centrifuges. Again, the JCPOA imposed tougher restrictions than this current Memorandum of Understanding. Next, we have the Strait of Hormuz to discuss. Now, the JCPOA never dealt with the Strait of Hormuz because it didn't need to. Back in 2015, Iran would never have restricted the waterway that was responsible for over 90% of its crude oil exports. But during the current conflict, once crude oil exports were restricted, Iran closed the strait and held global energy markets hostage. Today, the United States and Iran are differing on their rhetoric when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. The United States wants a long-term toll-free traffic to travel through the Strait of Hormuz, while Iran has stated that this will be assessed after 60 days. The Iranians could want a similar deal to Turkey with the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. Turkey has sovereignty over the straits, it can remilitarize them, it has authority over navigation, and significant control over the transit of military vessels from other nations. Now, this deal, which is known as the 1936 Montreux Convention, differs because Turkey controls both coasts of these straits. For Iran, any deal would have to occur with Oman. Also, the Strait of Hormuz is vital for global energy trade, especially crude oil and natural gas, but also crude products such as jet fuel. Giving Iran control and influence here would affect Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, and Bahrain. This would also not be like Suez or the Panama Canal, where one nation collects canal tolls. Also, the United States, potentially being restricted in its naval military capacity, is not likely to be a limitation that they would agree to. Back in 1936, Turkey was viewed as a neutral state that was suitable to be an administrator of the Straits. Iran is viewed very differently today. But such a deal would include Iran acknowledging the permanent commercial freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, which was one of the biggest issues of this conflict the longer that it dragged on. Still, the fact that we need to discuss the Strait of Hormuz at all shows that this current understanding is weaker than the JCPOA. There's also Iran's ballistic missile program to discuss. It has been reported that Iran's ballistic missile program remains 70% intact. This has been due to underground facilities remaining untouched. This is one such aspect that still gave Iran power in this war. They could continue to hit energy infrastructure in and around the Middle East, further impacting energy markets and putting upwards pressure on energy prices, which would hurt the rest of the world. This is one of the first characteristics where the JCPOA and the deal of today are relatively equal, because neither addressed Iran's missile program. Now, moving on to the inspection of Iran's nuclear facilities, the JCPOA included continuous monitoring, electronic surveillance, and supply chain monitoring. As per the recent Memorandum of Understanding, the United States says that inspectors will return, but some in Iran have denied this. Disagreements also exist over which sites will be accessed as a part of the recent understanding. Time will tell here, but for now, Iran seems to be standing firm for this current deal to be less restrictive than the JCPOA was. And finally, we have Iran's proxies. Now, Iran's proxies, including Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and Hamas, were not referred to in the JCPOA. The new Memorandum of Understanding also doesn't refer to these groups directly, aside from the end of the war between the United States and Iran being conditional on the end of the conflict in Lebanon, which does involve Hezbollah. But what is clear is that over the last few years, Iran's proxies have been massively weakened. Iran used to possess a land bridge of influence in the Middle East that travelled through Iraq, into Syria with the Assad regime, and into Lebanon through Hezbollah and onto the Mediterranean. Today, Iran's influence in Iraq has heavily declined. The Assad regime collapsed in Syria, which dramatically weakened Iran's influence in the nation, and Israel's actions in Lebanon have weakened Hezbollah and its leadership structure in the last few years. Neither the JCPOA nor the current Memorandum of Understanding address Iran's proxies, but many nations will hope that these groups won't be left in an environment where they can rebuild. Now, there is one notable issue in comparing the JCPOA to this understanding of today, and that's that this understanding is currently a temporary measure. Both sides have pledged to negotiate, but any analysis is dependent on a final deal. The JCPOA included legal obligations that were verifiable. This current understanding, if it leads to a final deal, seems like it would currently be weaker in almost all aspects of negotiation, and it would be less verifiable. Iran would have gained much more unilateral geopolitical influence in comparison to a decade ago. And there is also the fact that we might not get a final deal at all. Now, Trump wanted out of the conflict in Iran because the midterms are in November, and this war has been touted as one of the worst run US wars in history. Trump's popularity has also taken a huge hit. It was reported that US commercial crude oil inventories were reaching critically low levels. Inventories at Cushing, Oklahoma, which is the largest commercial storage hub in the United States, reached 20 million barrels. This is the lowest level in 12 years. As a result, there are many reasons why Trump wants a deal. But this deal, in many ways, is starting to look like a surrender when we compare it to the JCPOA. However, with any deal, we need to look deeper than what is presented on the surface. For now, if this understanding was to be formalised in its current format, Iran would look like the overall winner. But in the long term, are there any elements of this deal that would be hugely beneficial for the United States? It's this question that we'll seek to answer in next episode. Now, despite this deal seeming like it's weaker than the JCPOA, the United States will accumulate some victories if this understanding becomes a finalised deal. This isn't an entirely unbalanced pursuit. The war would officially end, as Trump needs, and nuclear inspectors could potentially return to Iran. The United States would also retain the option to reimpose sanctions if Iran did violate terms. Also, during the recent conflict, Iran's supreme leader was taken out in an airstrike, and Iran's air defence systems were breached substantially. In the aftermath, Iran will be economically weaker, and it is still internally fragmented and fragile. Finally, strikes against energy infrastructure of Middle Eastern nations could hurt energy markets and could see restrictions in energy markets continue and upwards pressure on price for the next few months. But these strikes will also leave Iran with few friends in the Middle East. But during the war, this supposed pressure and damage against Iran didn't translate into long-lasting success, and Iran withstood the pain. Now, Iran finds itself in a position to attempt to turn some of its perceived gains into real change. Despite some US wins, Iran has been gifted the card of control over the Strait of Hormuz, which it can also reimpose. And so, the Memorandum of Understanding offers the United States and Trump benefits by ending the war and the potential for a new environment under a new deal. But the conditions currently resemble a weaker JCPOA, which, with the power of hindsight, we can say that Trump himself never should have left. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. It really helps out the podcast. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.